Since Max Planck published in 1900 the laws of thermal radiation, and Niels Bohr said it was impossible to use, in the same physical phenomenon, a description in time and space of momentum, conversation, laws and energy, the universe is no longer the same. He opened the human mind to the perception of many ways of understanding reality, demanding full restructuring concepts. They have not put forward the Albert Einstein attempts to frame or limit the known universe to a single principle, for the human mind wanted to expand beyond established limits. The mechanistic logic had its day numbered. The regarded descent in the early days of quantum physics was only one of numerous divergencies in science, which is far from anonymous. It is not about quantum physics, but about the philosophy that you can do from the ruminations of their theoretical formulations. These ideas, speculations, and theories. They do not introduce complicated mathematical formulas or scientific experiments, but ideas and principles to support the reader reflections. So my look will be philosophical, psychological, and spiritualist, whose considerations are non-physical order. I believe it may not be possible to support me only in quantum physics, because science has reshaped its numerous theories times. I just want to make it clear to myself that recent discoveries in the scientific field, particularly in quantum physics, suggest a staging of the psyche to new perceptions of reality. The limits of human thought are still conditioned to the classical interpretations of reality according to exclusively materialistic assumptions. However, coming from a mechanistic and deterministic materialism contrary to reality today observed in what matter itself. Even the macrocosmic world is portrayed and thought second classical ideas outdated. The quantum process awareness. The fact that we cannot answer the above questions leads us to try somehow to elucidate the experience called life. Thus, man is free enough to organize his experience as watches. One way to think of this experience led me to the idea that if reality is not ready and our eye on it enables new organizations of the same, that is, if we can say that the mind creates reality, then perhaps it is also possible to build a model that gives this experience a sense, an order, a proper functioning. However, this model has not yet been discovered or invented by physical, currently considered quantum, while natural science, that is, the latter could not yet create or even imagine an atomic model that meets the new studies relating consciousness within fact, taking into account the evaluation of a science is much more related to what it can produce again, although this again is not a concept, than what it already has as known, why not say last truth. Life events have a synchronic relationship. This relationship consists of a subject experiencing its subjective and timeless experience, and an object apparently physically manifest by consciousness that observes. In this relationship, the guy needs briefly identify with awareness for, from there, to relate to the perceived object. However, this relationship does not go away or a pole or the other, because in the event duration, this perceived by intuition, both the subject and the object participate simultaneously in the event. That is, the event is a result of the collapse of the consciousness nodes and the seizure of a possibility, among many, of reality. Causality would then be in understanding the relationship of the events as cause and effect, and it is still limited to explain non-causal relations, which is called synchronicity. Such a concept would be the fourth condition a priori of experience. The other three are space, time and causality, and these concepts, formulated by born chances of discriminating activity of the conscious mind, were the necessary coordinates to describe the moving bodies of behavior that are therefore essentially psychic origin. Thus, synchronicity may be regarded as a special case of a non-causal regularity, a principal priority order in which the events are related in a meaningful way, i.e., the facts would relation to each other not only by connections casual to which they are subjected, the coordinates of time and space can encompass, but also connections endowed with significance for the development of consciousness, which circumscribes itself our moral, psychological and spiritual dimensions. For Jung, this meant that the mental world of meaning and intention was not played at random in the universe as a cosmic orphan, but he, along with the world of life and matter, forming a single cosmos. In this sense, the mind would then be a picture of this cosmic order as part of the operation of the laws of nature. However, I see no other resource than to own consciousness, a consciousness that goes back to your process and participate in reality as much as the reality is part of it. In this sense, consciousness can be perceived in different cosmos levels of an organization, which led me to think of 7 categories, or sets, ranging from macro to microcosm. Thus, the first category in which consciousness would be recognized would be the entire living organism. Our body system, where usually we stand, that is, our consciousness perceives egocentrically as a participant of the matter in its entirety, and it is precisely the reflexive attitude ego while not belonging to that body assembly that enables the development of consciousness. The second category is the set of bodies. The third, the set of tissues. The fourth, the set of cells. The fifth, the set of molecules. The sixth, the set of atoms, and the 7th category is the set of subatomic particles. However, it is worth doing a caveat. It is precisely the loss of this overall view that enables extreme sharpness, clarity, and certainty of the dynamics of cosmos, general laws of nature. In fact, I use the word set more to delineate the boundaries of each class and the design as universal in its peculiarities, than to define them as a separate or the other parts. It justifies the use of the word in quotes. Conscience. Once the consciousness begins to be recognized as a participant of the set of subatomic particles, as I see it now, belongs to the operation of the cosmos, the universe of the organization. But how it works? It is now admitting that consciousness belongs to the set of subatomic particles. We turn to physics to help us understand this dynamic. Currently, quantum physics, although it has not reached the image of an atomic model that explains the functioning of the universe from the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which not be the electron appears as a particle or as a wave, continues to adopt stationary states constituting the electron orbit levels K, L, M, N, O, P and Q. According to Heidegger, consciousness, as a phenomenon, is born of the dynamic and embodiments of the whole of reality and any real. It is processed in the operating year that man holds in this temporarily, that is, in its historical time. The being cannot be without their own spatial and temporal conditions to exercise. It is only because this is also the reality that is taking place, that is, in the process. Since consciousness uses a phenomenology, as stated above, it now participates in the set of subatomic particles that pass through these stationary states, aiming to identify the existence of energy nodes, or complex, to dissolve them to allow the natural flow of physic energy. For a consciousness that is expressed in the temporality of existence, the need for their development only arises when a tangle of emotions, with all its energy potential, breaks his conscience, leading man to think about themselves and their relationship with the world. The range of a new quantum level occurs in that the man maintains the tension caused by the presence of these affections. The more energy is charged, i.e. the more dynamic quanta are acting in tension relationship with other dynamic quanta, the greater the probability of realizing the quantum jump to a more advanced level of consciousness. It could be better understood by the tension between conscious and unconscious present in Jungian theory. There is a movement toward a dialectical understanding of the two, e.g. of a consciousness in which the unconscious predominates, as well as a consciousness in which the self-consciousness prevails, that is, an awareness so broad that it encompasses both self-awareness and the unconscious as possibility realization of being. Thus, the so-called unconscious is always aware of the unconscious itself. But for Hegel, this dialectical tension from a set of forces, as a conflict between thesis and antithesis resulting in a synthesis, was not named the conflict between emotions, which, it turns, appears in the writing of Nietzsche. When there is a man in touch with his emotions, understanding the nature of these enables a path that was once represented by a transcendent function. The transcendent function results from the union of conscious and unconscious contents. In other words, a man who is aware of the unconscious nature of his affections can connect to his computer center, in that it presents itself as a result of an ongoing effort of awareness of emotions running through him. Then, seeing his affections clash in a game of forces, the individual begins to have freedom of choices that will sustain its action. Hence, the action affects others and also the individuals. By feedback from the social environment of his action, in reality, the individual begins to be aware of the positive relationship between affection command, one who acts on all others, and the environment. As a laboratory, it is necessary to value, assess, interpret the affections consistently present in every situation. When it reaches this level of compliance, the individual can sustain the actions in this great found within themselves. The place Nietzsche called the pathos of the distance. In this context, the word has the meaning of the right dosage of passion. In it, the individual remains as those who hold the painful clash between the unconscious feelings and consciousness that tends to receive them in the process of transformation. So I can understand that this ongoing effort of the conflict support is what constitutes the transcendent function. To sustain the image, symbol through the memory, constant remembrance so that it can establish itself as affection, how much dynamic, and support the rational will to interpret its meaning. I understand that the tip is the meeting of consciousness with the unconscious when they seize all polarities and constellates the union of opposites, the masculine and feminine principles. The way they are presented is related to the modes of presentation of the neutrino, or little neutral one. 3 jokingly called types of flavors, the electron neutrino, the muon and tau, which do not yet have their operating understood by physical science, but in my view correspond to the momentum of the mentioned principles, with vector addition corresponding to the transcendent function, a principle that cannot be caused by any other to be himself, because of his own. I think that physical science should also take into consideration the possible existence of a 4th type of neutrino, called the sterile neutrino, which would give more meaning to the dynamics of principles, because for me the understanding of how this could only be given by the presence of the 4th principle, that for which man is destined, that is, an equivalent principle to man's existence purpose. Briefly, porting to a 2-dimensional graph, we can understand the c-axis, consciousness, and correspond to a pressure of interpretation, and the shaft I, unconscious, as corresponding to a host of the originating images. If every thought carries an affection, as Nietzsche wrote, so every time there is an effort to think this thought will be provided with a composed image of affective density. Let us look to the realization that these axes represent an initial conflict of the ego, as corresponds to a first step of the process of individuation. The ego. The ego is a given compound, first formed by a general perception of our body and existence, and following the records of our memory. We all have a particular idea we have already existed, that is, of our time in past lives. All we accumulated along series of memories. These 2 factors are the main components of the ego, which enable us to consider it as a complex of physic facts. The force of attraction of this complex is dominant as a magnet. It is he who draws the unconscious contents, that obscure region about which nothing is known. It also calls itself the outside impressions that become aware of their contact. If there is no such contact, such feelings remain unconscious. The ego is the center of our attention and our desires, and the essential core of consciousness. The art of consciously guide the psyche to the authentic experience, i.e. religious experience, suggests an accurate observance of coming from the unconscious images. However, for such images can reach the consciousness of the most reliable as possible, it is necessary that the ego, personality potential of the unit that meditates internal and external world, is in full compliance with them. Not just the existence of an ego that makes dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, but also an ego that, in continuous self-knowledge, ongoing discovery of selfhood can be the only vehicle of images to be originating. Thus, the dialogue between the unconscious and consciousness would give much for an imagistic flow than by analytical interpretation held by the intellect. Conduct based on this compliance provides the experience of religion, careful observation of yourself in a more ontological sense than the religier, rewire, together, make the join. However, the task of returning the eyes to its process when the contemporary would stimulate the sale of consumer society, and where the evils of that are no more than a set of own evils, lies too troublesome for individuals immersed in this constituency. I often say that not guided by values, beliefs and conventions is an act of courage, is a say yes to life, Nietzschean. But as the soul is religious, naturaliter, that is, it has by its very nature a reconnection function with its computer center, the man fits this experience religier, collect, understand, revisit, reread. He may deny the religious experience. However, this no will also be driven by the desire to self-realization and, given the overwhelming power of the unconscious, nothing would be left to be said for it. His will never override the power of the self. The ego-self axis is initially necessary to have the ego to move through the levels of consciousness, as he himself constituted as a transition vehicle to the self. Here arises, however, an obstacle. Once the ego is recognized, it is necessary to follow up his, what Hegel is understood as look philosopher, as if you took someone's arm and we took to a particular place. Thus, the philosopher must lower the ego, as if it was him, but with the awareness that this attitude, this pseudo-identification, is needed only to start the process, to go all the way. As I stated earlier, now the obstacle is how the philosopher positions the ego, and this factor is critical, since from there will be a set, its spiral path to be followed by consciousness. In this sense, the philosopher, while ego must prostrate in respect of the conflict between consciousness and the unconscious, not identified either as subject or as an object of knowledge, but sustaining the dialectic tension-caused conflict between them. This conflict between consciousness and the unconscious is nothing but the battle of what Nietzsche in 1888 posthumously called quanta-dynamic tension in a relationship with all other dynamic quanta. It turns out that currently conceive of consciousness we have as the last resort for our understanding of reality. We left her and her return as if it were the only instrument, completed in itself, that we, or rather as if we were to have it in its entirety. Assuming that our time is free of spirituality, which to me seems visible, it makes sense to shut us in the current consciousness model in our contemporary losing the wealth of questions, but our origin or purpose, reflections these that make possible a new look at our unique presence in the world. Why do we boycott ourselves in a progress reaching each accomplishes? Why is it that we cling to models when, in the exercise of our creativity, the realization of a new look, thinking, scientific construction would be the source of a joint development? It presupposes a process of reflection that takes us from what hitherto has been in force as a last resort that we use when it comes to ego identification. A man immersed in the current values of the current world is a missing contact man himself, out of his ethos, address, and so far an ethics which is not as a rule of conduct, but as a constant assessment of what it is helpful or not, what suits you or not. It is the significant obstacle. Think of the unconscious nature of what constitutes us. Believe that man does not end on that of current awareness model currently. More directed the originating neurophysiological processes in the brain according to show the neuroscience studies. To clarify what Nietzsche called quanta dynamic, I can also say about a game of forces, quantum vectors each other collide within the individual, tensing it in search of a synthesis. In this sense, who acts on all these vectors is the affection command, or the resulting Jung called transcendent function, the affection that stands in the conflictive relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. To explain more affordably what comes to communicating the word affection command, should I turn to a brief explanation of what Nietzsche called the will to power, which does not seem healthy for this work. In Beyond Good and Evil, for example, he states that the will is not only a complex of feeling and thinking, but above all, an affection that affection command. Why the philosopher, temporarily identified with the ego, must sustain the conflict of forces to the being in its coming to be is constituted as an expansion of consciousness, causing the new state's experience ego, of course, higher. Each synthesis elaborates a new state of consciousness that is reached, a quantum leap is given. Like everything new causes fear, astonishment or perplexity, the ego is also perceived a little confused in this cloudiness in which he now is. But just at that moment the ego, B, is neither what he was or what he is coming to be. It is still, in my view, a quantum cloud formed waves, as during the transition from one state to another there are the coordinates of time and space. They re-emerge when the ego reach a new orbit or state of consciousness. Until the electrons will be to organize to give stability to the ego still groping a seat, it can only again be recognized as such when you reach the next steady state. If before talking about the ego as an energy complex place that every state of consciousness reached the previous compound tends to dissolve, allowing an amalgam, why not say a union, between the ego and consciousness, many called moral conscience, that is, when there is no more distinction between what we are and what we have as moral values, when we become our consciousness. The awareness that spontaneously becomes reduced if the object of experience is so great that reduces the individual is responsible for a domain of morality, something also somewhat immeasurable. We understand why any action practiced by the subject cannot be judged as created, but as something resulting from a concept devoid of measurement expectations. Only to learn to live with morality without false moralism is that the subject can rescue I, lost to little crystallized notions, so more consistent with humanity to be rescued. More objective and detailed way, it seems that during the process of individuation, the ego, which until then was configured as a node, a condensed and therefore reliable, tend to lose and gain energy, as well as with electrons when they interact each other and emit radiation. However, this will only occur if the energy present in the load vector is equivalent, have the same charge, but with spin otherwise, to charge the involved energy node to be dissolved. It is noteworthy that think the complicated as having the same behavior of electrons, negative charges that turn on their stationary states around the nucleus, self or self, unpredictable but likely to dissolve when we submit the psyche to a more accurate reading of its operation. The dynamics of complex. In my view, the dynamics of the compound corresponds to the dynamics of electrons around the atomic nucleus. The complexes are the ways that allow us to reach the unconscious. The royal road that leads to the unconscious, however, are not dreams, as Freud thought, but compound, responsible for thoughts and symptoms. Complexly refers to the affect-laden ideas groupings, are autonomous and have their functioning and memory. The psyche can be addressed as a complex constellation, and that they have a wonderful content. The complex is the image of a particular psychic state of high emotional charge, and, moreover, incompatible with the provisions and usual situations of consciousness. This picture is endowed with great inner consistency, has its own full, and enjoys a relatively high degree of autonomy. The image is subject to the control of the provisions of consciousness to a limited extent, and therefore behave in the sphere of knowledge as a foreign body and life animated. Only the knowledge of this group of affective ideas by conscience does not guarantee that it ceases to disturb the functioning of the psyche, but it can be said that awareness is the first step for the redistribution of psychic energy in it. When this energy compound of incarceration is released, it can flow and be distributed toward new content in search of a psychological balance. This phenomenon, one of the most important factors of the therapeutic process, and in my opinion, it is configured as critical to the healing process of patients. Once the ego has become the subject of consciousness itself, the tension forces, ratio of quanta with other quanta dynamic, does not cease to exist, only this time the transcendent function will be constituted in the conflict between the ego and the unconscious as a constituent of the second stage of the process in order to achieve the self, the sum total of the conscious and unconscious contents, or, according to Nietzsche, when the individual becomes what it is. In this way, the energy complex, meeting electrons are seen as particles, the ego is dense, while affected by quantum vectors. To the extent they release or absorb a certain amount of energy, there will be quantum leaps in your size and are directly proportional to how much absorbed or released by the electrons. By way of information, the quanta was proposed by Max Planck in his attempt to prove that electromagnetic radiation consists of individual packages, which are also called photons. The elementary quantity, indivisible, this energy is called quantum. Therefore, the affection would be a beam of light, quantum, that transmits power through individual packets, quanta, or more accurately, photons. During the transition of electrons between the old orbit, and that is to be achieved, they live in a kind of fog, dark space, in which electrons behave as if they were scattered over a vast region of space. The ego, as a complex, meeting of quanta of energy, is lost in a kind of quantum dust, which before I called a conscience still in training, in search of a new stability. To this are issued sensors temporary that will, as possible ways of consciousness, until the next orbit in which electrons can settle. In quantum theory, these sensors are called virtual transitions, while his new home is called real transition. The release of these sensors is equivalent to images originated in the unconscious to guide the direction of the electrons in an attempt to fit them into a new orbit. Some scientists claim that quantum physics, and more specifically a quantum mechanical model of consciousness, allows us to see ourselves, our souls, if you will, as full partners in the processes of nature, both in matter and matter. If being is a being, possibly we can follow their dynamics, contemplate the inherent beauty of the cosmos manifests itself in the causal connections that are established in harmony with the universe. The vector, symbolizing the transcendent function, could be understood as a beam of light, quantum, that runs through the individual. And all that comes temporally with a wave of depression and despair, in the context of the transformation of personality, the awareness and experience of fantasies determine the assimilation of the lower and unconscious functions to consciousness, causing profound effects on the conscious attitude. I will not discuss now in its details how this can change a personality. I want to emphasize only the fact that it is an essential change. I called a transcendent function to this change obtained by the confrontation with the unconscious. Having the individual cover the various levels of consciousness, no longer occur identification, e.g., this concerns me, with the affections, light beams that interpret. In this layer, the nature of the problems becomes another. The level has nothing to do with the complexity of problems, what affects, but with the very nature of the affections. In fact, what changes in the process is the way we relate to the issues that arise in life. Only when we are affected, we can think of to understand what caused this, in the feel, or the source of this energy density. The more one understands the nature of effects, more the proper distance of the energy field, morphogenetic, in which an hour was affected. When a patient, in his therapeutic process, for example, begins to discuss their issues, of course, your speech reveals their emotional density, that is, in every discourse there is an affective charge, psychophysical, that can be calculated if the therapist is reading through the intellect, the module, the direction and the direction vector, affection as displacement vector. If perhaps at some point the therapist to identify with affection, that is, during the displacement of affect, it is hit or affected passively as stated by Spinoza, there will likely be a backlash of the patient, since he has not made aware of the nature of their affections, which prevents the reading accuracy. This, as it was said initially, does not carry the truth claim or any other claim that has no aim to draw on content to communicate, that is, to make clear that for many, as much as for me, still presents unclear. The fact that we found within this work names of thinkers and philosophers before our time only means trying to dialogue with those who may again think to such issues, helping to clarify what we now understand as necessary for the progress of humanity. Terms used herein cannot be defined because they have not yet become concepts. Since the construction of thought clarifies the idea that it intends to transmit, but there emerges a concept and can then be placed as a definition. I am aware that much of what is written here is previously mentioned by Carl Gustav Jung. It should not be a burden to the extent that whole observations and reflections of the same nature. Any human being who reflects on the meaning of life, about the meaning of man in the world, will surely approach such thoughts. Therefore, it is of real origin we take as valuable his contribution to the studies in the field of the psyche, but we are open to new buildings and new perspectives on the same phenomena. With awareness from there to relate to the perceived object. However, this relationship does not go away or a pole or the other, because in the event duration, this perceived by intuition, both the subject and the object participate simultaneously in the event. That is, the event is a result of the collapse of the consciousness notes and the seizure of a possibility, among many, of reality. Causality would then be in understanding the relationship of the events as cause and effect, and it is still limited to explain non-causal relations, which it called synchronicity. Such a concept would be the fourth condition a priori of experience. The other three are space, time and causality, and these concepts, formulated by born chances of discriminating activity of the conscious mind, were the necessary coordinates to describe the moving bodies of behavior that are therefore essentially psychic origin. Thus, synchronicity may be regarded as a special case of a non-causal regularity, a principal priority order in which the events are related in a meaningful way, i.e., the facts would relation to each other not only by connections casual to which they are subjected, the coordinates of time and space can encompass, but also connections endowed with significance for the development of consciousness, which circumscribes itself our moral, psychological and spiritual dimensions. For Jung, this meant that the mental world of meaning and intention was not played at random in the universe as a cosmic orphan, but he, along with the world of life and matter, forming a single cosmos. In this sense, the mind would then be a picture of this cosmic order as part of the operation of the laws of nature. However, I see no other resource than to own consciousness, a consciousness that goes back to your process and participate in reality as much as the reality is part of it. In this sense, consciousness can be perceived in different cosmos levels of an organization, which led me to think of 7 categories, or sets, ranging from macro to microcosm. Thus, the first category in which consciousness would be recognized would be the entire living organism, our body system, where you have to organize his experience as watches. One way to think of this experience led me to the idea that if reality is not ready and our eye on it enables new organizations of the same, that is, if we can say that the mind creates reality, then perhaps it is also possible to build a model that gives this experience a sense, an order, a proper functioning. However, this model has not yet been discovered or invented by physical, currently considered quantum, while natural science, that is, the latter could not yet create or even imagine an atomic model that meets the new studies relating consciousness within fact, taking into account the evaluation of a science is much more related to what it can produce again, although this again is not a concept, than what it already has as known, why not say last truth? Life events have a synchronic relationship. This relationship consists of a subject experiencing its subjective and timeless experience, and an object apparently physically manifest by consciousness that observes. In this relationship, the guy needs briefly identify Since Max Planck published in 1900 the laws of thermal radiation, and Niels Bohr said it was impossible to use, in the same physical phenomenon, a description in time and space of momentum, conversation, laws and energy, the universe is no longer the same. He opened the human mind to the perception of many ways of understanding reality, demanding full restructuring concepts. They have not put forward the Albert Einstein attempts to frame or limit the known universe to a single principle, for the human mind wanted to expand beyond established limits. The mechanistic logic had its day numbered. The regarded descent in the early days of quantum physics was only one of numerous divergencies in science, which is far from anonymous. It is not about quantum physics, but about the philosophy that you can do from the ruminations of their theoretical formulations. These ideas, speculations and theories. They do not introduce complicated mathematical formulas or scientific experiments, but ideas and principles to support the reader reflections. So my look will be philosophical, psychological and spiritualist, whose considerations are non-physical order. I believe it may not be possible, support me only in quantum physics, because science has reshaped its numerous theories times. I just want to make it clear to myself that recent discoveries in the scientific field, particularly in quantum physics, suggest a staging of the psyche to new perceptions of reality. The limits of human thought are still conditioned to the classical interpretations of reality according to exclusively materialistic assumptions. However, coming from a mechanistic and deterministic materialism contrary to reality today observed in what matter itself. Even the macrocosmic world is portrayed and thought second classical ideas outdated. The quantum process awareness. The fact that we cannot answer the above questions leads us to try somehow to elucidate the experience called life. Thus, man is free enough